there's a way in which anti-rights actors or anti-rights movements communicate. They don't often attack women's rights clearly or in a way that is easy to discern. A lot of the time when they are attacking women's rights or human rights more broadly, they will use narratives and they will say things like, we're actually trying to protect the family, or we're trying to protect children. And in many instances on the continent, we're also seeing them say that they're trying to protect African values, which include tradition, which include religion, but they're also saying things like we're trying to fight foreign ideologies being imported to the continent.
So then we also have Maram Mahdi, who is going to be co-piloting this episode with me today. So we're switching things up a bit. She's a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, ISS, and a scholar of human rights, bringing her expertise on security, governance, and human rights issues across the continent. Welcome to the podcast, Maram.
Thank you, Zenge. Glad to be your co-host for today.
Sure, yeah. So why don't you lead the way with the first questions then?
Okay, so women taking it over. No, thanks very much, Zenge, and thanks Sibusisiwe again for joining us this evening. Just start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself. What do you do? Just in general, a little bit more about your organization and background.
Thanks, Maram. I'm so glad to see that women are taking the lead. Right now, I work at the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, which is a Pan-African and feminist organization that uses, among other things, the law as a tool for social change. We have a number of broad thematic areas that include violence against women, women's socioeconomic rights, and countering anti-rights actors, which we call CARA. And that's what we're going to be delving quite deep into today. So essentially in CARA, we focus on resisting the anti-rights movement on the continent. And this is born out of the recognition that anti-rights movements are increasingly becoming more coordinated and more intentional in how they engage in the African regional human rights system. And they essentially pose a systemic threat because they seek to drive regressive agendas that seek to undermine women's human rights and human rights more broadly, as well as legal institutions and even democracy. So at ISLA, we have a number of different ways of working, which we call priority areas. And just roughly, the first one is building partnerships for social change, which houses our feminist litigation network, which is our pool of network lawyers, which we train and which we engage when we litigate strategically across the continent. That also houses our collaborations across the organization. Another priority area we have is producing knowledge for social change, which houses our work on research and publications. Then we have a priority area called strengthening capacity to litigate strategically, which focuses more on capacity strengthening. And then last but not least, we have litigation for social change, which is the strategic litigation arm of the organization. And that is where I'm based. And for the most part, we are using strategic litigation to oppose the lawfare that is posed by anti-rights actors. So broadly, when I say lawfare, I'm talking about the strategic weaponization of the law to drive ulterior motives. So yeah, that's a bit about me, a bit about ISLA.
So yeah, no, thanks for that, Sibusi. I think it's great, but to maybe pick up on that last point that you touched on, in terms of lawfare, and I think some of the legislation that is in place. So maybe if you can speak a little bit more about what actually is the anti-rights movement. I mean, it's not a term that I think a lot of people know and are very familiar with. So what is the anti-rights movement with respect to women?
You're right. It is a term that isn't really employed in common speak and probably not in podcasts as well. But when we talk about the anti-rights movement, we're talking about networks of different types of actors that include individuals, organizations, and even sometimes state actors who work to roll back on human rights standards and democratic principles more broadly. So what they do is they target different human rights, and they also target different issues. So just by way of illustration, because we are talking about women, some of the issues that they target more intensely or disproportionately are issues around sexuality and gender, which would obviously include women's rights issues. Prominent women's rights issues include things like access to abortion, access to contraception, and of course, gender-based violence. But we're also seeing them creep, of course, into the private sphere, including through family law. So when people say anti-rights, I usually refer to the term anti-rights more broadly, but some people prefer to use the term anti-gender movements to foreground the fact that the particular type of anti-rights movement that they're dealing with is one that focuses disproportionately on sexuality and gender. So there's a way in which anti-rights actors or anti-rights movements communicate. They don't often attack women's rights clearly or in a way that is easy to discern. A lot of the time when they are attacking women's rights or human rights more broadly, they will use narratives and they will say things like, we're actually trying to protect the family, or we're trying to protect children. And in many instances on the continent, we're also seeing them say that they're trying to protect African values, which include tradition, which include religion. But they're also saying things like we're trying to fight foreign ideologies being imported to the continent. So they don't often state their case in express terms. They use these narratives to reframe some of the human rights that we want to protect as being threats to society. But when you actually look at what is happening, they're using these emotive topics or emotive issues as a front to basically regress on some of the human rights protections that largely apply to women.
I'm actually very. I was gonna actually ask how this is like being propelled. Like, what tools are used to promote the anti-rights phenomenon? And you've sort of already gone into the fact that they circle around narratives like family planning and even African values, which is very interesting. And I'm just curious about the. I guess maybe you can define a bit more in terms of how this looks practically. So if there's a girl going to seek abortion, the fact that we're even talking about abortion is very unorthodox, because in many other countries, just even the mention of it is somewhat taboo. But I think maybe, for example, in Zambia, maybe the issue would be abortion, and in Somalia or the Gambia, I know there's lots of FGM, female genital mutilation, things going on. And actually, there was an Obama leader I was with 2 years ago or last year, and she was actually talking about it. And it seems to have been a very big sort of social movement fighting against it, and the same things that you're saying about African values and African sort of norms being the one that is being protected vis-a-vis what would otherwise be seen as something that is an affront to women's rights. So how does that look like in terms of like a practical case? How would that how would an anti-rights movement successfully curtail women's rights in a practical sort of case that you might know of?
Okay. That's actually a very good question. And I think it's always useful to use concrete examples so that people can understand, because I know it can get very, very abstract. So I'm glad you, Zenge, referred to FGM in the Gambia in particular. So let me take a few steps back. So a few years ago in the Gambia, they introduced a piece of legislation that was aimed at criminalizing FGM. So this was a piece of legislation that was introduced in recognition of the fact that FGM constitutes a harmful practice. It constitutes a form of violence against women, and it overall is a violation of women's rights. great. We have progressive legislation that is affirming a human rights standard that is applied internationally and also on the continent. So subsequent to that, there has been a court case, or there is a court case that is currently pending before the Supreme Court in the Gambia. And this case is about challenging that specific piece of legislation that was introduced. So what you're seeing in that case is anti-rights rhetoric. So when I say that, what I mean is the petitioners in that case argue that, among other things, this piece of legislation that was aimed at criminalizing FGM is actually violating women's rights. And they specifically point to women's right to religion as well as their right to culture. So these two things are being counterweighed against each other. And I'm going to probably speak about this a bit more later, but that's a distortion of the law, because the underlying purpose of what the law on FGM is about, which is to protect women and to protect their rights, the law and human rights are now being used as a basis to render this piece of legislation unconstitutional. So that type of rhetoric, which is very alarming, because they are using the same language that we use. They're using human rights. They're using consent. They're using autonomy, and they're using things that we have used as the women's rights movement to fight for our own rights and to gain some of these hard-fought wins that are allowing us to improve our lives. So that's one of the ways in which anti-rights actors will step, or anti-rights rhetoric creeps into the law and is weaponized against women to undermine their rights.
And I mean, I think maybe to pick up on that, and hopefully not to get you in too much trouble, but who are actually some of these actors, right? We want to talk about things in terms of concrete examples, but who are these actors? How do they push these narratives? Is it through social media? Is it through legislation? Is it through other digital spaces? And so how really are these narratives, how do they come out, essentially? I know particularly in the case of the Gambia, which is really an excellent example. I know that there was a case a couple of years back where there were women who were on trial for, cutting a baby, if I'm not mistaken. And in that particular case, there was actually a member of parliament who was also an imam, I think, who actually ended up paying for these sets of women, who actually ended up paying their trial fees and so on. And it was just to show that, definitely in those kind of cases, you actually have members of parliament, religious leaders and so on, that are quite influential in pushing the anti-rights movement.
I'm glad you've hopped onto that example, because it's quite a live issue, but it's also quite emotive. But what you often see is there are a broad range of people who can become anti-rights actors, some intentionally so, some unintentionally, but they can employ this rhetoric in a way that is harmful, in a way that undermines women's rights. So the thing about these narratives is the ones about family, the ones about children, about African values, is these are very easy things to latch onto. A lot of people can be in support of the family. Who doesn't want to support the family? A lot of people can be, especially in the age of decolonialism, we're all trying to fight foreign imports. So when you say we're fighting for African values, it's easy to latch onto that. So it becomes something that becomes an issue that can mobilize people. So a lot of different actors exist on the continent, but what we're seeing is there are much larger transnational actors who are pulling the strings. They are the ones who are funding campaigns. They are the ones who are organizing these conferences across the continent, conferences that are aimed at bringing together parliamentarians that are aimed at bringing together other political actors in the system. And what they're doing is they might even be sharing proposed bills about how can we protect the family in your jurisdiction. Here's a piece of draft legislation that you could be advancing in your jurisdiction to protect the family. So there are different ways in which they engage. We've spoken a bit about organizing online as well. There are big campaigns that are existing online. They talk about disinformation. They spread this message far and wide. So there isn't a single way in which they organize. They speak to traditional leaders. They speak to religious leaders. They speak to parents. They speak to teachers. They potentially can be mobilizing any number of actors who can be in support of some of the messages, because they've been very successful at bringing down these narratives to the person on the street and getting them to mobilize around them. But I think what's more important, for me at least, is these larger actors, these transnational ones. Those are the very dangerous ones that I believe are taking precedence from one place and transplanting it to another. They are the ones who are now taking initiatives on a regional level. They're not just being restricted to particular domestic jurisdictions. They're organizing regional conferences, bringing together judges, bringing together all of these different people who are quite important in the process of interpreting or even passing legislation as well, interpreting the law or passing legislation. So those big actors are the people that I think are quite problematic.